Michael Hoppen Gallery is probably the foremost photography gallery in London, and it is an extraordinary collection of 19th, 20th and 21st century photographers. And so when we approached Michael to see whether or not he would be able to spare some precious time to talk to us tonight about some of the great female photographers of that period, we were thrilled when he said yes. So I hope tonight that you will welcome him. And Michael, I hand over to you and let us talk about the great female photographers of the last couple of centuries.
Well, thank you, Nicola, and thank you also to all your wonderful staff who've helped me get the technology up and running, which is not something I'm very good at. So I think it's all going to work hopefully fine. But so I'm a huge fan of photography, obviously, and I've always loved female photographers, but I've never actually built a list. It was very hard to decide who to include and who not to include. So you've gone for days and days. The canon of photography is populated by extraordinary people from all over the world, and without women, I sort of realised more and more, it would look very poor in comparison. They've added so much to photography, and I've been also trying to figure out why that is, because of course, you know, part of the rationale behind examining photography is how people react to their environment, how people react to what they see and do. So of course in the 19th century, and we'll start I think with my favourite photographer of all time, is Julia Margaret Cameron. I don't know whether any of you have ever seen her work before. The V&A were lucky enough to have one of the greatest collections of her work in the world. And she was remarkable in the sense that she only took up photography in her 40s. Her children, I think, to get her out of the way, decided that a dark room with a lock on it was the best place. And she was as mad as a snake. They talk about her coming out of the dark room coated in collodion and her clothes covered in chemistry. It wasn't very good for her. Unfortunately, she died only after about 10 years of taking up photography from chemical poisoning in Ceylon. But she had this extraordinary ability to capture people in a way that revealed themselves. Of course, people weren't used to the camera as they are now, so they weren't hiding as we do now, but she also was really the first photographer to come close up. And technically speaking, that's very difficult to do with the equipment she had. I'm sure you can imagine, she would have had a camera, the size of these pictures is about 10 by 8, maybe a little bit bigger, and that's the size of the negative. And it would have had a bellows. I'm sure you've seen cameras with these bellows. And to get close to somebody and not get the cut-off, what we call cut-off in photography, those bellows would have had to extend a long, long way. And the exposure was, the film was very slow, was not very sensitive, light would have been very long. So these sitters would have to stay very still for a long time. And I think it was Thomas Carlyle who referred to her, or referred to himself as one of her victims. So most of her sitters knew that what they were going to be put through was not a sort of gentle process, but something where they really had to work and pay attention. So this is a gorgeous picture of a daughter of one of her friends. I think those are grapes around her head, but it's that ability to create something more than the sum of its sum, which makes her so extraordinary. And I've always, this particular print is at the V&A. You can go and look at her work. Anyone can go to the V&A and ask to see a box of her work. And she was surrounded by some of the good and the great of the day. This particular man is Sir John Herschel, who was instrumental in fixing photography. So he invented hypo or fixative, which made prints famous. And I love the sort of two different portraits. There's this crazy picture of him with his eyes rolling above his head. And why did she realise that would become one of the great pictures she ever took? Because a lot of people would have maybe called that an outtake and removed it. But for me, and I'm sorry about the quality of the slide, and you can see that these marks on the printer, in fact, because it's so old and it's been rubbed or scrubbed, you've got bits of collodion falling off the negative here. Second, third, fourth prints of these would all look very different because the process was alive. It wasn't today where you drop it off and somebody brings you back a roll film and then you go and print it. Everything was still moving. They were inventing the process as they made the pictures. So, you know, for me, photography is the perfect combination of art and science. And I think part of the rationale that I've come to realise about great women photographers is that they were able to build these recipes, or whatever you want to call it, in the darkroom and have that complete control. And there is an element, and I've always compared great photography to great cooking. Making great negatives, making great prints means you have to have all your ducks lined up, and you develop your own personality through the order that you line these ducks up, the temperature of the chemistry, the type of chemistry you use, the lighting you use. And in fact, we're going to move to the next picture, which I absolutely love, talking about lighting. The great scientist of his day, Darwin, as you know, produced the seminal book Origin of the Species, which was shocking to many. And in fact, I often wonder, when she lit, she would have had a studio with north light, with blinds. In fact, you can go and see her studio in Freshwater. It's still there today, on the Isle of Wight. And I wonder whether she had, she obviously knew Darwin well, and she must have read the book and heard all the chatter about it, and whether she thought, what an amazing brain, let's light it from above. And I don't know whether she was conscious of this, but he definitely comes from the ape. I mean, can you see that, or is it just me? But I think that's the art of a great photographer. It teases all the various elements out of a still image. There's no interview going on, there's no piece of film. She had to, in a sense, transmit what she felt about him in one picture. And I think this is a hugely successful picture, because we know a lot about him. We don't know a lot about the children that she photographed or the various people that she commissioned to pose for her. But I just think that, to me, shows her ability as an untrained photographer, because she really didn't know very much, but she had this instinct which led to extraordinary pictures like this. There's just a small selection of work. I mean, we've got these two, and again, but you see these fantastic mise-en-scène. She was brilliant at children. She created, there was a book called Idylls of the King, where she employed children and friends and local dignitaries to pose for her. And as I say, they referred to themselves as the victims of Julia Margaret Cameron. The difference in colour is partly down to the paucity of the transparencies, the files I was able to find, but it's also about the process. So albumen prints, which is what these are silver embedded in paper, which are then coated with egg albumen, and that obviously develops a colour and a pattern as it gets older. But what we all look for in Julia's work is this wonderful, rich mulberry colour. That, I would say, is about as perfect as it gets. And the fading on the edges is just down to process, but she did make great prints. She was, I think, within a year of becoming a photographer, she had sold 80 prints to the Victorian Albert Museum. So they have one of the finest collections of work, but this is within 1 year of her beginning to make pictures. So she was viewed, even in her day, by the V&A and by Colnaghi's, who started selling photography. There were more photographs being sold in London in Victorian days than today. I can attest to that. But the Victorians welcomed the science, and the art and science, I say, became this perfect marriage. For lots of people, they were able to take their cameras abroad. I won't talk too much about the male side of photography, but photography became a very popular pastime, and I'm convinced for every photographer I'm going to show you today or tonight, there are going to be lots who never revealed themselves in quite the same way. So there's one last picture of Mrs. Duckworth's daughter. It's a beautiful portrait. Again, it's that intensity, that wonderful clarity, and that ability to cut through all this sort of nonsense that often gets in the way of a photograph. And one more from the Idylls of the King. Again, very beautifully composed, very structured. And again, this, the costumes and all the production that went into this were quite substantial. So I could spend the whole hour talking about Julia, but I think we're going to have to move along. And just one last, which I just think is just absolutely amazing. And I would really urge you, as I say, that we live in the V&A allows you to just call up and say, I'd like to see a box of Julia Margaret Cameron's work. They'll present that box to you. You can sit at a table all by yourself and go through one by one with no glass on them. Nothing between you and the picture, and it's a fantastic offer that they present. Lady Clementina Hawarden appeared just before Julia Margaret. In fact, her first show at the V&A was the year that Julia was given a camera, but I put them in reverse for no particular reason. But she, again, was somebody, I think Julia had 6 children, Lady Clementina had 10 children, 8 survived. And to have brought up her daughters and to run a home and to have done all the things that present themselves in running a family must have been a hugely busy life, but somewhere in the middle she found time at home to create these extraordinary pictures of her children. She was fascinated by the way fabric fell. She loved mirrors, and again, these are very complicated pictures. They're not so straightforward portraits. So at the beginning of photography, you're talking about, this is 1863, I think, this picture. So we're very early in photography, and the prints have been rescued. Again, most of this is at the V&A, and I find them very contemporary in lots of respects. Again, I apologise for the quality of the JPEG, but that's pretty much how that print looks. It's been, as I say, saved, but part of its beauty is its damage. I think pattern is something that we all respect when it comes to furniture and when it comes to all sort of painting. For some reason, photography has to be perfect all the time, and I keep coming back to photographers like Lady Hawarden and John Deacon and others who allowed their prints to have a life. You know, they were shown, they were put into boxes, they were stuck into albums, and part of the enjoyment for me is how art travels, and certainly how photography has survived, because these things are very fragile. But as I say, she had this innate ability to create extraordinary pictures from very little. Obviously, the pre-Raphaelites were hugely influential. She was surrounded at the time with wonderful painters, and obviously Rossetti was not far away, and I think they must have all been aware of what was going on around them. And I can see the 20th century appearing in a way through the technology, but we're very much set in the 19th century in these pictures. And as I say, I love the fabrics. I'm a big collector, and I love textiles. And to see pictures that include textiles and light and beauty and talent all in the same frame, obviously is wonderful to see. So I don't know whether you know her work, but again, as I say, I find her pictures extraordinary. And as I say, I am convinced there will be many, many, many other women who took up photography in the day, whose work was either put into a drawer and forgotten about or lost. I mean, sadly, when I got involved in photography, I always heard stories about bins and barrel loads of photographs being burnt and chucked out. The BBC every week would chuck out huge barrels of those. They just couldn't keep them. And now it's considered vandalism. Then it was called good housekeeping. So it's sad that we've lost so much, and I'm sure within 20 minutes walk of where I'm standing, there will be a cupboard or drawer or something that you know about, which has got lots of old family photographs in them. And they're so precious. They're the way we pass memories on. It's the way we account for history. And in the strangest way, the internet, whilst it's wonderful, has ruined all of that. It's taken all that social history away, because emails don't last. The pictures that we email to friends onto a phone will die with the phone. And so I always say, print it onto paper, because there's living proof that printed onto paper will last forever. You can still look at the papyrus from Egypt today. It's 3,000 years old. It's still there today. And there's somebody in America, I think, who's downloading every web page ever published, and apparently they can't keep up with things, but there is somebody out there keeping it. But anyway, putting it onto paper is important, and she was a wonderful printer. This last one here is one of my favourite pictures. That's Exhibition Road. It's one of the balconies, and again, she's using drop focus, so the camera's really focused on that one plane, and whether she knew it or not, it has the most gorgeous, amazing quality to it. And again, this print's only about that big. It's very small. And I, as I say, I'm convinced that anyone who sees these pictures will be very captivated by them. But as I say, the influence of painting can clearly be felt. Another great 19th century photographer who really erred on the side of science more than art was somebody who investigated nature. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Anna Atkins. She created 3 wonderful publications, three that I know of, certainly that I've seen. One of seaweed, which is this one, and she wanted to create a catalogue, in a sense, a sort of Bible of seaweed and plants, and she was a scientist at heart, and she found drawing these incredibly difficult, but also they lacked the accuracy that a scientist would need and want for empirical evidence. So she, through John Herschel, who we saw earlier in Julia Margaret Cameron's series of pictures, helped her with a process called cyanotype. And a cyanotype is a 19th century process that always appears to be blue, because of its name. And it's a very permanent process. It's very simple in a way. You soak the paper in the chemistry and you expose it to ultraviolet. So in a sense, the seaweed would have been placed onto the surface of the paper and left in the sun for however long sensitivity needed, and then you remove the object to wash it, and you're left with this perfect, accurate outline of what she was asking the paper to produce. But again, for me, there's something beautiful about science when it's made beautifully, because I think Buckminster Fuller said if the solution that you come up with is not beautiful, you haven't solved the problem. She absolutely solved the problem here, I think. And again, I would urge you to look at the work the V&A have a set of the books, and the colour is so beautiful and so intense. And the shapes, they're like abstractions in a strange way. I think there's one more here, which I think is stunning. But I could have just, again, spoken for hours and looked at every plate, because every single, she then did ferns, and one other book. As I say, each one is unique, because you can't make copies of these. So every copy has its own particular dynamic. There was a set of, the last set to come was found at Eton College in their library. Again, you know, they were books for learning, they were books for people being able to refer to and draw. And photographs have often been used by artists. It was only really, you know, quite recent that artists have admitted that they use photographs to work from. So it works both ways. Picasso did. Lots of photographers have used, lots of painters have used photography. Like Degas, he was the one who discovered that horses, when they're galloping, all four hooves are off the ground. That was proven by looking at Muybridge's animal locomotion photographs, the earlier ones by Marais. But anyway, there is an Anna Atkins cyanotype, and again, she's one of the great 19th century proponents using photography for its scientific abilities. We move swiftly along to the end of the 19th century, the 20th century, and across the pond to America, where I'm afraid to say photography was revered and accepted as an art form in a much greater extent than here in England. And she was a society photographer. She photographed, she made wonderful portraits. She worked for many years and encouraged women to take up the camera, because she believed that it was a way of women becoming independent, earning a living, and also being able to stay at home at the same time. You didn't have to go to an office, you didn't have to go to a studio to work. It's why we don't see many female engineers and architects and people in the 19th century, because you had to work within large groups and work in offices a lot of the time. Whereas photography really allowed you to work on your own. It was just accessing, obviously, the people who would come to have their portraits taken. And she, as I say, was really championed women to become photographers, and offered all sorts of incentives and prizes and financial help through some of the societies she worked with to encourage them to do so. And I'm sure you have seen that picture. It's one of the great late 19th century American portraits. That I think is rather beautiful. Clarence White refers to this picture a lot as one of the sort of great paintings of photography, and I think it's very easy to imagine. Sometimes photographers will coat their own negatives or their own papers. In this case, it's not a platinum print, it's a silver print. I think it is actually. I'm not sure actually, it looks more platinum to me, but in a sense, coating your own paper and mixing your own chemistry allows you to have so much more control. And again, I think part of what I love about the female photographers that I was looking at and continue to look at is that, in a sense, that individuality they have, that signature, and that is quite often built through the chemistry in their own particular recipes and way of working. Stieglitz encouraged her, of course, to experiment with all sorts of different processes, from gum bichromate to platinum. I mean, I think today there's 174 different ways to make a photograph. In 1900, I don't know how many there were, but it was continuously being looked at and refined and changed. And there's a Steichen print coming up at auction quite soon, which I think will make many, many millions, which has so many layers of chemistry and attention to it. It really is something that needs to be seen to be believed. And again, you know, these prints, we're only looking at a screen here. Part of the problem with photography is you do need to see the prints. It's a very different experience. There's a show at the Photographer's Gallery at the moment that I would definitely recommend you see, by Christopher Killip. The prints are some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It's a bit like a perfume ad in a magazine. You don't smell the perfume until you open the bottle. So we move into the 20th century. As I say, it was very hard to know who to include and who to leave out, because there could have been dozens already that I haven't mentioned, but Claude Cahoon is born in the 19th century. I don't know whether you know her work. She was an extraordinary woman. She lived in Guernsey, and she, like many photographers, examined herself and her sexuality and the politics around her. She was sadly put in jail by the Nazis when they took over the Channel Islands. But she continued to protest, and I just think this picture, I think, is probably 1920. I think it's an extraordinary piece of work. And the Jersey Trust actually own most of the work. If you ever find yourself in Jersey, although the shows have travelled a lot, it's wonderful to go and see these pictures. She was a strange woman, to say the least, but she made pictures that are truly contemporary and I think survive today. I mean, that's 1920. And I mean, the books on her just... And funny enough, I went to Guernsey to try and find a man who cleared our house, a man called John Wakem. And I finally found him. And I bought quite a lot of things from him. One of them was a book which had all her negatives in, or a lot of the negatives, to this series. So this was a book called Hawarden, which is considered one of the great sort of feminist books of the early 20th century. It's a very hard book to find. And all the negatives were sitting with this book. It was her copy. And I placed that book and all the negatives in a museum, and we ran some platinum prints from the negatives, which is what I'm showing you a copy of here, which we've given to museums because they really are the only way of seeing these pictures unless you happen to own a book. So again, for me, she is a great artist. I don't want to call her more than a photographer, because photography was absolutely her medium. But if you look at her work and see the way she used the camera, turned it on herself, a little bit like a photographer called Francesca Woodman, who I didn't bring into this talk, funny enough. I don't know why, but very wonderful to have compared the two of them. But it's that self-examination of her sexuality and her politics, and knowing that she's working in isolation makes it almost more important and more pertinent, because today, of course, everything's up on the web, and you've got everything, Instagram, everyone's commenting and liking and disliking. Her and her partner were literally living in this small house in the middle of nowhere, making these pictures, which I find extraordinary. Because there was no radio and television that was pumping the stuff into their home. We're in the middle of the war, and she's coming up with things like this. This particular picture here, that's a picture of her. It's an amazing pair of glasses that she made herself. So anyway, that's Claude Cahoon, and again, I wish I could have shown you much, much more of her work, but I think a little taste of it is enough. Back to America, and Imogen Cunningham again was an extraordinary American from West Coast. She started a group called F64, and on a lens, an old lens, you would have the aperture ring, and that would go from 5.6 all the way around to F64, which was as small as it could go. And she encouraged, again, women and lots of other West Coast photographers. She was actually taught by a female photographer called Anne Brigman, and she went out on her own and made an extraordinary impact on West Coast American photography. I'm sure Edward Weston is a name you would recognise. And again, not showing the men who were working at the time is quite odd, because it's very important to understand how these people were being grouped together and how they were sharing their particular likes, dislikes, the conversations they must have had, the books they were writing about photography. This is brand new stuff. These cameras and the film that they were using were fast. It allowed them to freeze motion. I mean, look at that. Isn't that just the most incredible picture? I think that's 1932 from memory. She loved photographing dance, and I just think that's an exquisite photograph. And there's something about the age of it which again helps me understand how complicated this would have been to set up. Because today I think we take for granted, flash and all the things that were invented later on in the 20th century today, as I say, we just point the phone at something, we don't even have to look at it, and it's done. So a lot of work goes into making a picture like this, and that is the distinction I think is important to make. The difference between taking pictures, which is what most of us do, and the difference is these people made pictures. So making pictures and taking pictures is one of the distinctions I think is important to recognise. As I say, I love the fact that she would look at very simple moments in life, flowers, an unmade bed, I mean, I find that it's almost like a piece of sculpture, isn't it? And I think the next picture, if I flick between the two, I just think, you know, how beautiful are those two pictures?
Yeah.
It's called the Tower of Jewels. It's a magnolia, which is obviously a very beautiful flower all by itself. So how do you add something to something that's already so beautiful? You know, that's the art of art, isn't it? We look at something that's beautiful and we think we can do better than that, and I think she does. I think that's an exquisite picture, but as I say, I love the way she sees there's something very beautiful about that bed and something exquisite about the Tower of Jewels that I think, I've always said, in a way, the best picture you'll ever take will be 50 metres or 50 yards from your front door, and I think one of the advantages that women had, although we're going to change tack a bit later when we come to Lee Miller, one of the advantages women had was that they were at home. They were, in a sense, tied to the home a lot of the time, but they were still able to make extraordinary pictures. You don't need to travel halfway around the world to make a great picture. It's quite exciting, but you don't have to do it. So I love avant-garde photography, and of course I like the way women, especially in the Bauhaus, were allowed to develop their particular craft. And Florence Henry was one of the great avant-garde photographers of the day. She was trained as an architect, as a designer, but she really adopted photography. And at the Bauhaus, as you know, all the students were encouraged to try lots and lots of different disciplines, from working with tubular steel, to working with cameras, to working with design and paint and theatre costumes, theatre lighting. It was that incredible combination which we've now adopted as the foundation course at art school that really gave everyone who entered the Bauhaus this opportunity to experiment and to try things. And Florence Henry was a great exponent of trying lots and lots of different ways of photographing things. And I mean, that I think is one of the most beautiful still lifes that she made. I mean, that's a combination of shooting outside and inside with paper being cut out and objects. So I think the mirror and the lemon are real. I think this is cut out. Part of the joy of deconstructing the photograph is trying to figure out how people made things. She had wonderful teachers. The great one, of course, is Michael Hoppen, who was one of the greatest teachers of all time. And I think you can see his influence. Also, Peter Hans, one of the other great teachers at the Bauhaus, was a huge influence on her work. And there you go, one of the great tubular steel chairs that was made. I think that's a picture of her. Funny, I think that's a self-portrait. I've never been able to figure out who that is, but I'm pretty sure that is her. And again, I show these pictures by her because they give you a sense about how photography becomes something very different. You know, we were just looking at that unmade bed and that beautiful magnolia, and suddenly the photograph becomes this hard, structured, mechanical piece of kit. And that's the Bauhaus. That's the influence of Bauhaus, of course. And I find it intriguing, and I like the fact that, you know, one is aware of, you know, the wires and all the sort of structure that builds into it, and it's very much part of the way that the students at the Bauhaus were asked to view their work. And again, I remember seeing this particular print for the first time many years ago and being totally captivated by it. And it introduces all sorts of interesting discussions technically about depth of field and photographing to mirrors. And so that lesson that she learned whilst working with great teachers, I would love to have seen the outtakes, put it that way, the edits. One of the jobs that photography has been brilliant at doing is showing us what's going on in the world. And as I said just now, some of the best pictures I think any photographer can take will be only 50 yards from their door. Dorothea Lange, who was working as a student, was working close to home, became a member of the FSA, the Farm Society Administration, FSA, during the Great Depression in America. And this particular picture, which I'm sure you know, is one of the defining portraits of the 20th century. Could a man have made this picture? I don't know. There were lots of men photographing the Depression in America who made great pictures, very, very evocative, strong pictures. But this picture, to me, it was as a semi-religious composition. Obviously, it's a classic triangle. To me, really does define what not only America was going through at the time, but also how powerful the photographic image could be. And this picture appeared in life, and it's still a powerful picture today. I do think, you know, great art continues to to resonate and ripple through us. And I think you show this picture and you don't need to know an awful lot about what's going on. And again, the contact sheet to this, I don't know if you've ever seen the befores and afters, are fascinating because you see the picture developing, because you know what the final result will be, you see her getting closer and closer and closer to it. And maybe that would have been interesting actually to have showed the contact as well. But as I say, I find Dorothea Lange's work, especially her ability to create, a bit like Cameron, she didn't need big space to create great pictures. And, you know, how do you tell a busy, thrusting American society that was going through huge change, that there are people out there who need to be considered and helped? And as I say, I think both these pictures are quite extraordinary. And again, you know, she had this ability to tell a story softly and quietly. Look at this. I mean, the composition is perfect. She was a great printer. Again, part of the ability to make great pictures is not in the shutter and the film and selecting the aperture and the process, but selecting the paper and making the prints. And I've always got lots of time for photographers who make their own prints. I don't have a lot of time for the ones that don't, because I think they're missing half the fun and half the problem. And the problem has to be solved, because there would have been lots of issues there, but it's the clouds in that glass, which are not really clear on the slide, are quite amazing, because there's lots of definition in the background as well. And this last one here is probably, again, one of her most famous pictures. It's an early one, but it's, again, very beautiful, sensitive. I'm always, you know, it's a bit like, what's his name, Stefan Zweig, Beware of Pity. You know, it's always reminded me, you know, you want to be very careful when you make pictures like this, because it can actually descend into something that goes beyond what it's meant to do. But these people needed help. There were bread lines, and people like Dorothea Lange and another photographer we're going to see later were brilliant at transmitting these messages through their pictures. And that's not to say there weren't men doing the job well as well. But I do think there is a sensitivity to the female gaze, if I can use that expression, that in some ways supports a different type of emotion, and I think it's more subtle, but it is a job that, as I say, women have taken to like ducks to water, and have been exemplary and have been brilliant at bringing incredible pictures back. And magazines like Life and Picture Post and all these other magazines welcomed these women into their arms, and they were treated as equals, which at the time was not always the case, in a world that was punishing. I mean, this was not easy. You weren't sort of going out in some big limo to take this picture back home for the night. They were living out on the field, as Lee Miller did in the war, as Dorothea Lange did during the Great Depression. It was hard work and tough, and also hard to face up to what you were seeing, because you had to walk away from this. You know, you couldn't do an awful lot apart from take this message back, and the message had to ring loud and clear. Another great American photographer was Berenice Abbott. I don't know if you know her work. She was a young girl who ended up in Paris in the 20s and worked for a man called Eugene Auger, who most people had forgotten about. He documented Paris in a very extraordinary way with a plate camera, and she became his assistant. And when he died, she bought 500 negatives and prints back. In fact, eventually donated them to the Met, or the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But the influence that Auger created was that it's all about observation. And she then proceeded to document every nook and cranny of New York. It's the most extraordinary body of work. It's called, I think it's called Disappearing New York, and it's a huge book of pictures of the city as it was being changed and redeveloped. It was when Elisha Otis presented the elevator in New York in 1911, I think. Suddenly New York went from 2 stories high, and the sky was the limit. So his invention allowed the city to change. So she really actively, for I think it was 15, 20 years, documented the whole city, and one of her best known pictures is that one. If you've ever seen a print of that, again, I'm sorry we're looking at it on the screens, it looks pretty miserable there, but it is the most exquisite, beautiful print when you see it. She not only could take great pictures, but she made great prints. And at the end of this particular chapter, she decided to give up photographing, so she started photographing science. And so she applied all her ability, because she worked on a large plate camera, to photographing science and illustrating the wonders of science. So this is two magnets creating magnetic field. And they're very beautiful pictures, but they are, again, empirical evidence that were used by many people as teaching aids and for licensing, for publishing in magazines and books. And that one I just thought was rather funny. I hadn't seen that for years, and again, it's her ability. That's a mirror, and it's reflecting the same eye. So that must have been a huge eye that she put, several feet away for that thing to reflect into. And as a little adjunct to that, I thought that's a beautiful self-portrait she made of herself, which I've always enjoyed. But she was a remarkable woman, as I say. She didn't stick to one thing. She always challenged herself in her ability through where she placed herself. So again, at the beginning, I was talking about how photographers react to things, and for me, that is part of what makes photographers interesting. You can put 10 photographers in a room, and they will all react to the room in a different way. One of them, two of them, three may find something extraordinary. The rest of us will just sort of mill around wondering what the hell we're doing. How she was able to adapt from her early years in Paris working for Auger into disappearing in New York, and then on to science, and lots of other pictures. Well, she photographed jazz, she photographed all sorts of things, but wonderful printer and a great photographer, and somebody who I'd like to spend more time researching, actually. Dorothea Lange, we spoke about just now, and I think that I almost prefer this lady, Margaret Bourke-White. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard of her. She's less well known. She was super brave. There she was on top of the Chrysler building making one of the seminal pictures down onto the traffic and people on the street. I've actually been on that floor. It's called Club in the Clouds. It is terrifying. It was a speakeasy at the top. There was one was a wooden bench on the wall. Everyone had their booze under their seat, and they got up there and drink during the what was it called? Prohibition. Thank you. But anyway, again, she ran a studio. She took up. Her father was a scientist. Her mother was an artist, and she was given a camera at a very young age. Had a crack in the lens, in fact. So for the first few years, she worked with that. But she became a photographer of note and travelled all over the world for Life magazine. As I say, incredibly brave. That's one of her best known images. And again, social commentary was one of her strong points. She also was in Europe at the end of the war, and she documented, as did Lee Miller, the liberation of the camps. And again, when I was looking through these pictures, and I purposely didn't include too many of them because they are very harrowing pictures, but is there a difference to the way a man like George Roger photographed this terrible, terrible moment, and Lee Miller and her? I don't think there is. I think they come to these situations as human beings, and I think that's what's important to recognise, that whether you're a man or a woman, it's about being a human being, somebody who has that sensitivity to be able to recognise how important these pictures are to take, and not to become too emotionally tied to them, but to do your job as a professional photographer. But as I say, it was interesting to see Lee's pictures downstairs, because they are very harrowing, and I think it took a tough person to be able to go into these places and do the job they did. One of the things I'm a huge fan of is her printing, and when she really got stuck into it and she really knew how to print, she was using this very, very heavy American paper, tons of silver. And again, these prints are some of the best industrial prints I've ever seen. She worked for Sikorsky, which is where this comes from. She worked on the building of the Panama Canal. Again, these were pictures that would appear in Life and many other magazines around the world. And the American Steel Mills is a fantastic series. And again, imagine the noise and the chaos and the sounds and the smell. And this woman walks in with her big plate camera, and you're close up. This is not digital. This is not going to be retouched later. You have to get right in there and do the picture and understand what will end up on the negative, because there's no preview. So huge talent, huge technical ability. And as I say, I don't know why, but you don't tend to see a lot of her work. I mean, in my world you do, but I have never seen a show here. And I think it would be an extraordinary thing to promise if you look at her work. And it's a very, I had, I think, 7 or 8 more slides of hers here, of German families committing suicide at the end of the war when in Berlin and things. I mean, really, really tough pictures, but unbelievably well executed. probably no introduction needed. It's all here. So I haven't included too many pictures, but I think, luckily, I've included pictures that you don't have here. So what can one say about Lee? Beautiful, talented, extraordinary, apparently very amusing and incredibly inventive. I don't know whether you know, downstairs there's a solarised portrait downstairs, which is must be a copy, but solarised prints are unique, and she invented solarisation. She walked into the dark room, or she was in the dark with Man Ray one day and switched on the light, said, oops, switched it straight off, and that moment, that flash of light produces, I haven't put a solarised print in here, funny enough, but it's the one as you're walking on the left, this beautiful portrait. And so she had, her fingers were everywhere, in the cameras, in the darkroom, in the developer, and she was a remarkable woman, and I love seeing the pictures downstairs of her and Picasso with the kids in the water. It's just like a normal day out at the beach, really, but two amazing people to go to the beach, and that's one of the great pictures, when her first marriage was to an Egyptian man, and she made some incredible pictures in the desert. And this is, I remember seeing this, the V&A have a very beautiful small print of this in their collection. And again, it's just one of those pictures that is timeless and very hard to figure out what makes this such an extraordinary image. But it is something that she recognised, because of course you have to recognise that when you make the picture, and then when of course you make the print. And it's lived on. I mean, I think this picture is probably one of her better known surrealist images, as is that one, which I absolutely adore, and this one, which I think is just a classic, beautiful moment. But I mean, again, not a very good slide, I'm afraid. The print of that in the collection is quite beautiful. And my favourite picture of all by her, which again I'm pleased to see you don't have downstairs, it would ruin the surprise, is that one. And that's called The Exploding Hand. And again, a very strange moment. It's there's a house in Ireland, in I think it's up in Sligo, called Lissadale House, and there's it's owned by a family called the Gore Booths, and it was her wedding ring. Every time she opened the handle, the stone on her wedding ring would cut and scratch the glass. And what I love is that she sees this opportunity to create a picture that deals with that aberration, or whatever you want to call it, and turns into something quite extraordinary. And again, I should have tried to photograph my own print, because this tends to blow out more, and it does look like the hand is exploding, almost more white, and the screen is taking that fun out of it. But again, I mean, everything about this picture is just fantastic. I don't really know the portrait of Lee in the big sailcloth trousers. She's standing on the back. She could hold the court, Lee. She was amazing. But that is my absolute favourite picture by her. But she has many great pictures under her belt. She was a very, very talented woman, but also an extraordinary influence on the people around her. You just look at those Picasso looking at her through her camera to recognise that she absolutely held him, in her spell. And this last one, I think, is an amazing picture again. Again, no Photoshop. I mean, just think about how you make that picture. Think through the process. Right, I've got this great idea, and I think it's a remarkable piece of work. And Claude Cahoon, who we were looking at a little earlier, made a very similar picture to this, with her head surrounded by objects. And there was one other picture I skipped over because I got it in the wrong order. But again, there's the sort of picture I'm talking about. That's a tough picture to make. And one of the things I've collected for many years at the gallery is crime photography, and not war photography, but crime. And it's an important part of photography. It's a role that it has to play. It provides evidence for solving crime, and I don't know why, but I'm drawn to it because it doesn't deal with composition. It doesn't deal with some of the things that most artists have to think through. i.e. it's arriving at a scene and saying, how can I show what has happened here? And this is a family that obviously committed suicide at the end of the war in Berlin. But as I say, a remarkable woman who defines many of the attributes that I think modern women aspire to today: independence, talent, the ability to move around from war to society and feel completely at ease in everything she did, and to carry that camera with her and to record what she saw is amazing. I love the picture of her in the bath next door, of course. It's not by her, but it's a great picture. But anyway, so there's a little bit about the lady who you're lucky enough to have permanently downstairs. fashion photography is something that a lot of women, a lot of photographers, I should say, have gravitated towards, and women have also excelled at. One of my favourite photographers from the early years, this is 40s, is Louise Dahl-Wolfe. And that picture that we're looking at now, I think, could have been taken yesterday. Again, absolutely timeless. It's the Mojave Desert. It's 1945, I think, or 46. And I think it's Lisa Fonsegrief from memory who became Irving Penn's wife. But to me, it's again classic and beautiful. It's taken fashion out of the studio. It was Martin Munkaci, the Hungarian photographer, in 1931, who really removed fashion out of the studio and turned into more of a lifestyle. It's the thing. It's the way fashion is viewed very much today still. And the energy, and maybe not in here, the energy that Munkaci brought to it was everything was moving. Dahl-Wolfe made a more sort of what we would call today more traditional fashion photo, but in its day it was considered very daring, and she loved using props and art. She would photograph at the Getty Villa and all sorts of places using Greek statuary, and she was a photographer who really changed the way fashion photographers became in the latter years, and I love this particular picture. It's one of her classic images, again, very structured, very set up, but again, it sold lots of swimming costumes, but I think a good picture in its own right. And I think commercial photography, it's not really a dirty word if it's beautifully done. You know? Because, I mean, we were looking at Bourke-White's photographs just now. Those were commercial photographs for the American Steel Corporation. So I don't think there's anything wrong with photography. It's very useful. Before, you had those very stilted pictures in magazines that really didn't do it. So to bring artistry and talent and sensitivity to the pictures obviously helped it do their job. And a nice little segue from that picture to this picture, I think, is quite interesting. I don't know whether you know the photographer Diane Arbus, but again, somebody who won very hard to put a handle on her because she did such extraordinary things. She was a street photographer. She was very approachable. There she is in Central Park with this rather strange apparatus with the flash and everything, and she was very disturbed, but one of the things I love about it is she got again to the core of the matter. Part of the job that photographers have to do is to get people to reveal themselves, and it's so hard to do, even more so today because we're all on guard. As soon as the iPhone or the camera comes out, we tuck our tummy in. Everything has to sort of be corrected, but somehow great photographers relax people in a particular way, and kids are obviously some of the hardest to photograph. All this picture's become an icon photograph of the 20th century. She photographed lots of twins, but I mean that was the one that stuck. I love the fact that she put herself into very unusual circumstances. I'm never quite sure whether that was intentional, was the vignetting at the top, that would have been a lens shade on the camera. But she looked at American society and I think decided that a mirror needed to be held up to it, and I think she did it in a very eloquent way. But I was lucky enough to know a man called Peter Crookston, who was the picture editor at The Observer in his 60s, and he was Diane's lover. And he came to me one day and said, "Michael, I'd like you to look after my collection of ephemera that Diana left me." She committed suicide, sadly. And so he delivered this extraordinary box of prints, but it was the letters that I found fascinating. And I never copied them because part of what I felt was important was these were real documents. It shouldn't be copied. It was the physical object that needed to retain its haptic experience rather than being seen. And they have been reproduced in books, but she would use a typewriter, and the first line would have one letter, the second line would have 2, 3, 4, 5, until you got to the last line, which had 20 words in it. So it was 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, and these extraordinary letters that were, you imagine on a typewriter having to sort of format all that by flicking the thing backwards and forwards. And they were as obsessive and as intense as the pictures were. So it was part of her DNA, was this total absorption in her world and what she wanted to see. And there have been a few films and documentaries about it, but it's really the shows that you have to see. And she had this funny little enlargement which you would print from. The prints were very unusual. This is quite a high contrast version of it, but her prints used high key a lot of the time. As I say, she travelled mostly around America. She did do some work in London, but most of the work was in and around New York. And I find them very strange pictures even today. It's very hard to imagine anyone being able to make pictures like this today with such effortlessness and also with such agility. I don't know how to explain what I'm trying to say about her, but these pictures are very unusual in sequence, but also as individual pictures, they really stand up in their own right. Part of the issue with photography is quite often the narrative is important. You need to see the story develop, the beginning, the middle, and the end. With Diane, every picture, in a sense, is a story all by itself. And there's a wonderful contact sheet of this, and she's talking to him. You can see him, you know, playing with his hands and things, and she's directing him up to a point, but he's being allowed to behave in the way a child behaves. But she is, as I say, if you haven't examined her work, she is really an extraordinary photographer, and probably one of the most important photographers, regardless of her sex, one of the most important photographers of the 20th century. This is not chronological, as somebody is probably going to tell me, but Tina Modotti was another female photographer whose work I find extraordinary and influential. She was Italian, but ended up in Mexico, like a lot of people fleeing Europe, and was adopted by Edward Weston, who helped her understand the technology behind the camera, but more importantly, how to print. Well, not more importantly, as importantly, how to print. And her meetings with Trotsky, and her meetings with Frida Kahlo, her meetings with Diego de Rivera, and the sort of workers' rights and the communist politics of the day were highly influential to her practice. This is an extraordinary picture of farm workers who were striking for new pay. And this would never have been considered allowable in America. And of course, these pictures, Edward Weston was encouraging her to make pictures such as this. This was taken from the roof of her apartment in Mexico City. And again, the details of the people on the march, or the workers whose rights she was defending through a camera, have become icons of American photography. And she's a very important and a much loved photographer. And as I say, the circles she mixed in was fascinating, highly influential. I mean, you know, if you'd gone to a party, there was Frida Kahlo, Diego de Rivera, Trotsky, Edward Weston. I mean, you know, what more could you want? But she also made a wonderful picture called Heavy Roses. This is, again, not a great JPEG. I would love to be able to show you the print. I find it very frustrating not having them actually here. That's a sort of $1 million, that photograph, if you can find it. But it is, again, a strange abstraction. It was very much the first of it, you know, the first of its kind. And that's the important thing to recognise. A lot of these people are making these pictures for the very first time, and they continue to influence us today. This particular photographer, I'm not sure you would have heard of, and again, it was very hard to decide who to include and who not to include, because there are many photographers who are not going to appear, but she was unusual in the sense she was a white middle-class woman who decided to devote her working practice, which took up photography quite late in life. A lot of these women did adopt photography quite late on in their lives. It wasn't something they went to art school and decided I'm going to be a photographer. But she decided to document the African American population on the west coast of America. And her printing style was quite amazing. I mean, again, these pictures, when you see them, bring tears to your eyes, because you can see the lines and the hands and all the traces that life has left on these people. And the body of work she left behind is amazing. They do appear from time to time. There have been some wonderful shows at SF MoMA that I've seen in America. And the way she isolates the figures is quite unusual. You know, quite often you see context. You see, buildings or the streets. People like Roy de Carava and lots of other documentary photographers have shown how tough American cities were to live in, and Consuelo decided to focus on faces and hands and bodies, and so all her work is very much focused on that. And the influence is really felt with Dorothea Lange, who's working a little bit earlier to her, but there's definitely a sense that she was part of something. And I mentioned earlier F64, which was the group of photographers that Imogen Cunningham formed. and Consuelo Kanaga was a member of that particular group of women who were out there making great pictures and building careers for themselves at the same time. She was very much at the forefront of that group. Another photographer who I've always enjoyed, a little bit like Diane Arbus, is Lizette Model. She photographed a different way of looking at what was going on in the cities she visited. She photographed in New York, which is where this is, a fairly scary picture, and she made big prints like this, fantastic big prints. But again, she was aware of what was going on with people like Ouija, the press photographer, and the ability of the small camera. We're down to much smaller bits of apparatus in the 20th century compared to what the 19th century photographers were having to cope with, tripods and big cameras and film and slides. These were cameras with roll film, as with Lee Miller's camera next door. You could get 12 or 24 different exposures on the camera, and it was something you could carry in your hand. This was on the, I think this is Cannes or Nice, and again, it's a frighteningly accurate portrait of somebody who likes gambling and sun too much, I think. But, you know, I like what's going on in the background as well. I mean, to me, you know, the fact that she can create a diorama with what's encouraging you to look at him in the face in this rather strange, uncomfortable position he's in, and then the woman who's slightly drop focus to the left, and then everything, we know where we are. There's a real sense of place with her pictures. And again, I mean, there's wonderful, wonderful books, and I often find with photographers they adopt a similar position with the camera all the time. One of the things that I think this evening's illustrates is how easy it is to move the camera around, and you develop a much more interesting scope of how you see things. And what I love about Lizette Model, she did a whole series of pictures of the New York streets with the feet and the days of Fifth Avenue, huge throngs of people. You can imagine this woman on the ground, probably lying on the ground with her camera, and making, I think, just some of the most noisy photographs I've ever seen. I mean, you can really hear that picture, can't you? Yeah. And again, they're wonderful, wonderful prints. And you learn a lot from people's shoes and their clothes and things. There's, I think it's Marilyn Minto, who's a great contemporary female photographer today, who did a picture of a woman's feet, and she's got cracked heels. She's obviously somebody who's had a tough time, has had to walk up, the heels are breaking, everything's collapsing, and you see these lines in the back of her heel, and the story's in the picture. And again, I think this is a real sort of metropolis picture. There's a whole series of these, they're fantastic pictures. So again, as I say, Lizette Model is a street photographer, but a street photographer with a difference, and also with great ability. And again, these people are making fantastic prints, and these prints are amazing to see. Photographer who, they say, I think it was Eve Arnold who told me this picture, a photographer again who's not in tonight's talk, who should be, but she said to me, she was once told by, I think Kertész, who was from Hungary, that you don't have to be Hungarian to be a great photographer, but it helps. And we are lucky enough to have, you know, people like Brassai and Kertész and Kaci and Capra and so many amazing photographers. And this particular lady, Kati Horna, who was born in Budapest, and that's a self-portrait of her. She came to Paris before the war, and then at the outset of the Spanish Civil War, she travelled south with Capa, who was a friend of hers, and she documented the mothers of the Spanish Civil War, where he documented soldiers dying in the Spanish Civil War. But Kati was a very interesting woman who spent time with Capa, so she knew what it was like to be on the front line. She had a real sense of home about her. She loved her family and was very disturbed by the movement in Europe, and decided to actually leave Europe altogether, and bravely ended up in New York and ended up in Mexico City by way of New York, where she spent the rest of her life. And in fact, she knew a woman called Leonora Carrington, you've got a lovely picture of downstairs, and there's Leonora in Mexico City in the 50s. So Kati was an interesting photographer who started, as I say, as a war correspondent in a way, but ended up actually chucking her lot in with the surrealists in Mexico City, which was a very vital, fantastic group of people, Henry James, Leonora Carrington, and many others who I mean, the city is still a real melting pot of people. I love Mexico City. It's fantastic. You meet people from all over the world there. And I think in the 50s, late 40s and early 50s, when the rest of the world was sort of trying to sort of clamber out of the Second World War, she was making extraordinary pictures like this. In fact, Tate Modern have got a show up, I think it's up at the moment, with a nice group of pictures from us in there from this particular series, so I thought I'd included more. But Kati's definitely worth investigating, and was a very interesting photo. Didn't make the greatest prints in the world, but what she made pictures of, I mean, I love that, don't you? Fantastic picture. Vivian Maier, so we talked earlier about the amount of photographers who've made great pictures and bodies of work that we probably don't know about. And if you've never heard of Vivian Maier, I'll tell you a little bit about her. She was, I think, originally German, came to New York in the after the war, and was a very keen amateur photographer. And she continued to make pictures. She was a nanny. She worked for lots of different families. Many of them been interviewed. Remember her making pictures on her days off, but as she got older and couldn't work anymore, her luck changed, and unfortunately she couldn't pay rent on her storage, and all her photographs and negatives and cameras were sold off, and she died in, I think 1990, I want to say. I should know, actually, I can find out. But anyway, what happened was somebody bought everything. It was stored in some lockup in Chicago, and two gentlemen bought the lot and started printing. So there were lots of rolls of films undeveloped. She couldn't afford to develop the film. So they started developing the roll of the film and printing it. What they found was this extraordinary body of work, thousands and thousands of negatives. This is a self-portrait of Vivian with her Rolleiflex. Thousands of pictures by Vivian that showed a woman with massive talent. I think if she'd gone to a magazine or a newspaper or a gallery during her lifetime, she would have been snapped up. And sadly, she never lived to see the fact that she's become an industry all by itself. I'm not a big fan of posthumous printing, in the sense that she never made any of the prints that we now look at. They've been engineered by these guys, and there are all sorts of issues with the estate and the family and relatives of hers who are now saying they own them and they should never have been printed without their permission. But the fact is that doesn't get in the way of us being able to see extraordinary talent making extraordinary pictures over a period of 40 years. But as I say, I would love to have shown you much more of her work, but time limits it. But she was a photographer of huge talent. Nobody quite knows where she learnt, but maybe she was self-taught. I've often thought self-taught is best taught, because you come up with your own particular visual language. But there are just a couple of pictures by her which I think are fantastic, and I would certainly recommend. There's some very good books, and I think there have been some good shows here actually over the years. Photography can be something else rather than a document. A lot of what we've looked at this evening are documents of sorts. But when an artist such as Cindy Sherman takes a camera as her way of communicating, the document disappears and an interpretation or a slightly different way of working appears. And so her college project was this extraordinary series of film stills. They're very small, 10 by 8 pictures like this, and her degree show must have been extraordinary to see because they refer to obviously all the great cinema. This is straight out of Psycho, you know, the sort of film noir that she was referencing all the time was well known and recognised by the audience in America, and so she was adopted very easily. And as I say, she is very much a part of the contemporary art scene. She still makes work today. It tends to be colour work. This is a sort of classic, again, cinematic piece of work relating to celebrity. And again, it's about female identity, and she is always the subject of every picture she makes. So she's turning the camera on herself. And I find that, you know, interesting, again, thinking the other night when I was putting this together, how many female photographers have turned the camera on themselves to illustrate, to highlight their particular issues using their own bodies and their own sensibilities to communicate, I think is brilliant. Some men have done it, but I don't think quite as successfully. I think Cindy's work is amazing. She references paintings, she references films, and that challenge every day to make a picture of yourself every single day. I know a woman I know, in fact, did that for 2 years. She sent me a picture of herself every single day. And some of them were amazing. They really were. She said some mornings were a nightmare. She got up to, okay, what am I going to do today? Because it was always at home. Every picture was at home. It was during the lockdown, and it's an extraordinary set of pictures. But again, I think the challenge is to come up with ideas and also to do them as professionally as she does, because these prints are very large. She's obviously working with people to do makeup and costume with her, but I think what I liked in the beginning was these early pictures where she's definitely as a student in charge of everything, the makeup, the hair, the costume, and the viewpoint. Again, is she holding her camera like this, or she got it on a tripod? It's the back office, which I often find interesting in the way photographers create pictures. It's rather sad that I can't bring up lots of English photographers, because I would love to be talking about English photography, but I'm afraid to say we don't treat it in quite the same way here. And there are lots of great English photographers, but the plethora of American photographers who've made it big and have made very influential bodies of work are too important to miss out, because I felt that it was important to talk about photographers who've made their mark, who've influenced the way we look at photography. Nan Goldin is a remarkable artist who photographed herself amongst a group of friends in New York who were gay, drug addicts, living on the periphery of society. And she says, I think in an interview, she says, she was captivated by queens. I mean, she loved living with them and inhabiting their lives. But her first show was, I think it was 400 slides, so you don't see her work on a wall in a row. Her work is very much part of a narrative, so you see these slides changing every 30 seconds, and it's an amazing experience, like watching a film, but every frame is still, and you get this chance to study them, and there's a painterly quality to the way she works. Obviously, it's all found light, it's found situation. She's not arranging anything, but she's working within the circle of people who had to go through pretty terrible times in the 70s and 80s with the advent of AIDS and the laws that were operating at the time. And so she was this is her. This is her here. Can you see her lying on the bed? She had a tough time, but she persevered. As I say, the body of work is now considered to be one of the most important series of pictures about American LGBT society in America in the 70s and 80s. Now it's something a lot of people point their cameras at, but at the time this was a very brave series of pictures, and as I say, was adopted by the community, the photographic community, and has been seen really around the world, I'm happy to say, because they are wonderful, wonderful pictures. Another woman whose work I find fascinating is this lady, Ishiuchi Miyako. She's Japanese, she trains as a textile designer, and she's often said to me that making textiles is very similar to making photographs. You start out with a blank sheet of paper, or just a ball of cotton or wool, or a sheet of fabric, and you have to make something out of it. And when she prints, she's on her knees in huge great baths. She used to print at her mother's house by the beach where the temperature's right, and you can see her sort of scrubbing these prints to produce this extraordinary grain. She was self-taught. Her boyfriend gave her a camera when she was 19 years old, and she's really focused on the traces that are left behind by human activity. And in her case, one of the things that was very important to her was the American occupation of Japan, which is still ongoing today, and she lived in this town called Yokosuka, which is where this battleship is parked. And she used to use the camera as almost a defence when they would wolf whistle her when she'd be walking down the street and the GIs were there. And she started actually loading film to the camera, and she had her first show in 1977 in a bar in Yokosuka, and I met her 15 years ago, and we've become very good friends, and I still show her work. In fact, we showed that at Freeze Masters, although it's a terrible JPEG of it. But again, for me, she prints so beautifully, and these grainy prints are very hard to make. It's a mistake, but again, it's her recipe. So she underexposed her film, she overdeveloped, and the developer was too warm. She got this wonderful grainy sort of structure out of it, and she As I say, she's represented her country at the Venice Biennale, she's shown at the Getty, she's shown at Tate, and she's a remarkable woman. She creates documents. This is from a series called Apartment, which is the way she was brought up as a little girl, was living in these very, very run-down blocks of flats in a small town called Yokosuka. And there's something very, very lonely about her work. I thought that picture was quite bizarre. It's a shame we're not seeing it the way it should be seen, but her work has a real resonance to it. And she actually just had a show at the Edinburgh Festival. It was one of the shows at the Edinburgh Festival this year, and people were very taken with her work. She was showing work from Hiroshima, so she's been commissioned by the museum in Hiroshima in Japan to document the clothes that were left behind by the bomb, and she continues to do that on an ongoing basis. As clothes and belongings are delivered to the museum, she continues to photograph them. But she's, as I say, photographs or points her camera at many different things. There's a Buto dancer she photographed for many years, and this print, which is about this big, is probably one of the most beautiful silver prints I've ever seen. You can, the skin is alive, and the way she's printed every aspect of it. And she works on a very small camera. She's not, these are not people working with very expensive big cameras and equipment. This is very rudimentary, but again, she just does it so well that it's very hard to see how she's teasing this information out of the paper. But again, I find each body of work she creates, she created a body of work about her mother. This is what appeared at the Venice Biennale. She didn't have a very good relationship with her mother, and when she died, she started examining all the things that her mother had left behind: the hairbrush, the nail varnish, the lipstick, and these small little moments within the objects themselves tell you an awful lot about the woman herself and the way she was observing them in a very objective way, but they're very subjective photographs. So again, it's that dichotomy within her work that I find creates attention, as the pictures themselves are pretty simple. And because of her ability to observe in a particular way, she was invited by the Casa Azul in Mexico to photograph all of Frida Kahlo's possessions, because when she died, her husband, Diego de Rivera, locked everything up in the bathroom because they were both communists and he didn't want their belongings and letters to be found by anyone and for there to be problems. And all the belongings were left in this bathroom for 50 years until the housekeeper died. The room was opened up, and suddenly they found her leg and her swimming costume and all her clothes and things. And Ishiuchi was asked by the Mexican government to come and make these documents, and they are extraordinary documents.
Is that on 35mm?
All on a very basic little 35mm camera. Yeah. And in fact, the blueness you can see is a reflection of the wall from Casa Azul, if you've ever been to the house in Coyoacán in Mexico. It's an amazing place. But as I say, that show travelled to London. I remember we saw the Frida Kahlo show at the V&A a few years ago. But the boot was there, but also Ishiuchi's photographs were there as well. And they are really wonderful pictures. When we had the show, in fact, of the combination of Frida and Ishiuchi together, I've never seen anything like it. People flew from literally all over the world to see the show. And in fact, it was because of that show that V&A, I'm happy to say, decided to take on the larger show, because our show was very small. But I love the bell. You see the bells on her boot. Knew she was coming. But as I say, a remarkable photographer. She photographed the postman and this and that. You could see, she photographed their foot with nothing on. You could see the wear on this postman's feet, or she'd photographed somebody who'd been injured in something. You could see their scars. It's a wonderful book with pictures of scars on bodies, and it's that very sensitive, very detailed observation that creates a much bigger story. You don't need to see the whole room. You just see these little traces that life have left behind. So as I say, a really remarkable, intelligent woman who I've got to know very well. And all these photographers we've talked about tonight, I wish I'd got to know all of them very well, but in a way, they've all been good enough to leave us with these remarkable photographs, which allows us, just walking around the house tonight, looking at all Lee Miller's pictures, you're allowed into their world, you're allowed to see what they were looking at, and if they're eloquent and they know how to do what they do so well, that language is in fact very understandable. It's a language that I think every individual photographer has their own unique language, but if it's clear, it's understandable. And one other fashion photographer I again have a lot of time for is a woman called Sarah Moon. She comes from the sort of late 60s, early 70s. She was photographing Bieber, and she was in fact a model herself. But again, she creates these exquisite colour prints, which she does with layers of pigment. Again, handmade prints. There is something very beautiful about a handmade object. And rather than digital printing, these are prints that are made with layers and layers of pigments. And again, if you see the pictures themselves, she's never really changed, Sarah. She's just been who she is, and I love her for that. She's still alive today. She's one of the last ones standing from that generation, from the 60s and 70s. And again, there's a sort of simplicity to her work which belies how complicated it is, and that's, to me, sort of, you know, that could only be in one place, really. And that's absolutely by Sarah, and she makes very beautiful pictures. And today, at 80-something years old, I've never asked her exactly how old she is. I know that would be very rude, but she's an enigma amongst us all. But she continues to make extraordinary work, which has I don't think there's anyone else making work like her. I'm not saying she's the best. I'm just saying she's very different and she's very special. As I say, I think her work will live on. I really do. Another person, another woman who I have a lot of time for, I don't know how much time we have left actually, but is another photographer who points a camera at herself, Zanele Muholi. She had, again, a show at Tate Modern a few years ago, and she's become a great ambassador not only for her country, South Africa, which she's gay, but in her country, if you were discovered to be gay, you could be necklaced, which is having a rubber tie put around your neck and lit. So in the face of all this extraordinary sexual apartheid, and I find it quite ironic that in South Africa, having known how horrible it is to be singled out as different and therefore and punished for that difference, that this is still the case in Africa today. But I love the way she works, and there are 3 great portraits of her by her. She, you know, she's clearly very conscious of the colonial type of pictures that we Europeans brought back from Africa. She's clearly conscious of the sort of comic nature of the way Africa is portrayed in literature and the boys' own annuals and all the rest of it. And she confronts that, and she's looking straight at you. There's absolutely, that gaze is just brilliant, and I adore her work. I've met her several times. She's a highly intelligent, very, very sophisticated young woman, and an incredibly talented photographer, and she's produced a wonderful body of work, and I love the way she usurps and disrupts all the things. I mean, I love this. I could have chosen pictures of her with Hoover cables around her and forks, and I mean, she's wonderfully inventive, and again, these are all things she's doing at home, and her early work is very much homemade cottage industry work with tremendous power and ability to communicate. That's one that I love as well. She had a show in Arles a few years ago, and I think this picture was about 20 foot across. It was just amazing. And it's that sense of pride and confronting all the issues. I don't know if you saw the show at Tate. It was a really remarkable show. It was the first show after lockdown, in fact, I think, that Tate had on. And again, the way she prints. I mean, funny if she doesn't make her prints, I forgive her for that. But she knows who to choose to make her prints, if that makes sense. So the collaborative nature, if you can't go into a darkroom, and it is very difficult to do, it's like being a racing driver. You know, do you fix your own engine? I don't know. You know when it's working right. So if you know when it's working properly and all the various valves and everything are tuned properly, and you've got a printer that understands the way you see, I think that collaborative relationship is very important, and it works. I mean, Joseph Koudelka, one of the great Magnum photographers, stopped producing prints when his printer retired because he said, I can't print, and if Voy won't print for me, there are no more prints. And it was, I'd love to see a lecture or talk between the two of them, because they both offer something that's intrinsic to the success of the photograph, i.e. without one, the photograph doesn't work. So Zanele has a great printer, and as I say, produces wonderful prints for her work, and I think, you know, she's really somebody to take note of, because with everything that's sort of stacked against her, she's created a brilliant career for herself, and she's an international superstar today because of her photography.
And I think the show's about to reel.
I did hear that it was coming back, yeah. It wasn't on for long.
Because they cut it off.
Vivian Sasson Dutch, born in Africa as well. I don't know why we've ended up on Africa, but it's the light is so wonderful, maybe, and the way Vivian sees Africa is quite amazing. She was brought up in Tanzania. She is a fashion photographer in a way, but she brings something much more to fashion. I love the fact that, you know, when you're a photographer, you're photographing black skin, you have to open up the lens to allow enough light to reach the film to show, and I love the fact she's done completely opposite. So it's a fantastic graphic. And everything she does, I didn't really know what to choose. I could have chosen hundreds of pictures, like all of them. It's very hard to choose pictures, but everything Vivian touches, I think, is very different and very unusual. She doesn't adopt in any shape or form a traditional composition, a traditional way of working. She's very much about colour. Recently she started making pictures that have paint on them, or she uses filters to filter the light onto skin, like this one, which I think is wonderful. But then very traditional pictures like this, where she's using the light cutting across the smoke, and as I say, every picture that I've ever seen of hers wakes you up. She really does challenge some of the traditional mores of photography, and certainly the fashion industry has adopted her in a way that very few other fashion photographers have been allowed to do what they want. Most photographers are art directed. If I speak to a lot of old photographers, say we were never art directed, we just did what we wanted to do, but today people are far too scared to do that. You know, when you look at Guy Bourdin's work for shoes, what he did for Charles Jourdain, no shoe manufacturer would ever allow you to do that today. We've become much too controlling in that sense. And that's a picture of hers that, in fact, I bought several years ago, which I absolutely love. It's a collage, and again, it's a remarkably beautiful picture. And then, just to finish off, I'll show you one of my favourite photographs of all time. Happens to be by a woman, and it's that one, which I just think is just the most. She was from Trieste. She was called Van der Volts, and she didn't make that many brilliant photographs, but that one is, in my humble opinion, just one of the great pictures of all time. And it's two negatives printed together, so it's a self-portrait of her. And again, if I'd been smart, I would have brought you both the elements to see. But believe me, she was very beautiful, and so was the cat. And the combination is perfect. I rest my case.